All right, so first of all, I just want to say welcome and thank you for joining this session as part of the Global Azure Conference. Today I'm going to be talking to you about Azure Functions and not necessarily just specifically about Azure Functions, but more along the lines of how you can extend Azure Functions. So, for example, at the moment, Azure Functions, it allows you to essentially deploy serverless applications to, in several languages. So you can use things like JavaScript, you can use Python, Java, and .NET as well to deploy your applications. Now, at the moment, those are the only ones that are supported. But what if what if you wanted to essentially build in a language that was not officially supported by Azure Functions or the Azure Functions runtime? Well, you can use this thing called custom handlers to essentially do that. You can use these custom handlers to basically create a server in the language of your choice, right? So this can be Go or anything else that's not officially supported. And then you can basically deploy that as a serverless application, right? So essentially how Azure Function handlers typically work is you can define triggers, right? So, and as well as the bindings for inputs and outputs. And the Azure Functions host sits right in the middle of right in the middle of this whole workflow. Okay, so whenever there's a trigger, whether that's HTTP, blob storage, whatever that trigger may be, the Azure Function host takes that information and it basically proxies the payload, the request payload, to the web server. Now, the web server is that piece of code that you have written in the language of your choice, containing the logic to execute whenever an Azure Functions endpoint is basically requested, right? So that proxy makes a request to your web server. Your web server then processes that request, and then it returns a response back to the Azure Functions host. Once the Azure Functions host has received the payload, the response payload, it then goes ahead and uses the bindings that you've defined for your outputs, and it returns those outputs to the application or wherever it is that you're trying to use that data downstream. Okay. Now you might say to yourself, okay, well, why would I want to do this? And there are certainly a few scenarios that I could think of where you might want to do something like this. Number one, let's say that, for example, your stack is in a language that is not officially supported by Azure Functions, but you do want to sort of have that, you want to be able to essentially deploy your application to a serverless environment because your requirements don't necessarily need you to have your application up all the time. You just need to have it sort of based on events that occur. All right, so that's one scenario. And again, if your stack is written in some other language that's not officially supported, you can leverage custom handlers to do that. Another scenario which may happen, and I'm going to show throughout this talk, is, well, what if I wanted to, let's say I'm using a language, or I've written a web server already in a language, whether that is supported or not supported. And I'm going to show the scenario where I'm going to write a server in a supported server, a supported language, F Sharp, but I'm going to do things a little bit differently. And the reason why you might want that is, well, I've already have the sort of the patterns and the structures of my particular application set up. And now maybe, like I said, my requirements have changed and now I want to make it serverless, or I want to use the specific patterns for the framework that I'm using. And I don't want to necessarily have to rewrite those to make my application serverless. I just want to deploy my web server as is for the most part, and using Azure Functions custom handlers. That's another way that you can do this. So let's take a look at the first scenario of basically building a serverless application with Azure Functions custom handlers for a language that is not supported. Okay, so let me get out of this. Let's go to the code. Okay, so here what I have is a web server that is running Racket. So Racket is a very powerful, very fun language. It's a Lisp dialect. It's actually I think it's closer to Scheme, I believe, right? So let's say that I have this really awesome service that I want to essentially deploy as an Azure function, as a serverless application. But you know, how can I do that, right? I don't know if there's a way in Racket for me to do that. Well, with Azure Functions custom handlers, what we can do is we can essentially write a web server just like we normally would in Racket, right? And doing that is, you know, fairly trivial. Racket provides a lot of built-in functionality to help you do that basically in a very fast and efficient way. And you can, again, just write the server, and then you add additional configurations that allow you to basically then deploy this application as a serverless, as an Azure function. Okay, so let's take a look at what this application is doing. There's nothing particularly interesting here. First, we basically have an environment variable called functions HTTP worker port. And basically all we're doing is we're just defining it. We're saying this port is going to have the value of that environment variable called functions HTTP worker. Then what we're doing here is we are creating an HTTP handler, right? Or a handler to basically process our response, right? Okay. And we're calling that get values. It's going to take in a request. It's going to return, if successful, it's going to return a 200 with an OK message. It's going to return the response as a JSON object, and essentially all it's going to have this sort of JSON object where the key is value, and the value contained as part of the value key is a list of 3 numbers. Okay, so now that's essentially what's going to execute whenever I basically hit a particular endpoint, and the endpoints are defined here. And basically I'm telling it, hey, whenever somebody makes a request to the values endpoint, and it's a get request, call the get values handler, right? And essentially that's what it's going to do. And here all I'm doing is I'm just setting up my server. Okay, so nothing particularly interesting here. Again, this is just writing a server. Now if we were to go ahead and try to execute this application, right? One of the important things, and I'll show it later, is this tends to work it's much easier to get this working if you can basically write or build these applications as sort of like a single executable, which systems like Go allow you to do that. Programming languages like Go allow you to do that. Racket certainly allows you to do that, and so does .NET. Right? There's several frameworks out there that allow you to publish single executables. Okay, so in this case, let's say I want to run this just as a web server, right? So the way that I do that is assuming that I have already built my application using Racket, which is sort of like the thing that you would use to build executables for Racket, right? So once that's done, essentially I have this single executable here, right, which contains the logic for my web server. Then what I can do is I can basically just run that executable, server.exe, and you'll see that it's listening on port 7071 because that's the port that I told it to listen on. Now, if I want to basically make a request, if I make a get request to the values endpoint, what we should get in this case is a list of values. 1 second. XP localhost 7071. 1 second. Interesting. So that should have worked. It's localhost 7071. It's telling me that it's not found. Interesting. Let's see. Start. Oh, it's unavailable. Oh, sorry. Okay, so that's why it's not working. I apologize. I actually had another instance of another application running. Okay, so now it should work. Okay, so I had another instance running, and that's why it was kind of like giving me trouble. Okay, so if I were to make a GET request to values, as you can see, there is exactly what I was mentioning earlier, right? It's going to return a basically a JSON object with a single key called value and an array of numbers. Okay, so this is running as you would typically run a web server with Racket, right? Okay, nothing special there. Now, what if I wanted to basically make this an Azure function? Now, the way that I would go about that with custom handlers is, the first thing is I would create a new sort of directory, and the name of my directory would be the same as that of the route that I'm trying to basically of the endpoint that I'm trying to establish or that I'm trying to build. And within that values folder, you're going to have a function.json file. And now this function.json file, what it will contain is basically the bindings and the schema of what the input and the output is. In this particular case, the bindings, this particular function or Azure function is going to be triggered by an HTTP request. And what's going to be coming in is some request, and the method that is accepted is a GET request, right? So you can only make GET requests to this particular endpoint. Okay. Now the output, again, it's going to be an HTTP response, right? So anything that can basically process HTTP, you can basically use with this particular for this particular application. Okay. Now once I have that set up for my specific for my specific endpoint, you basically just create this other file in sort of the root level of your particular project, and you basically call host.json, right? And it's a JSON file as well. And all you're telling it is, hey, use version 2 of the host or runtime, and then basically use the HTTP worker to basically execute this this single executable, which was the executable that we ran last time, right? Is that server.exe file containing our Racket web server. Okay, cool. So now you have this, and now you want to run this as an Azure function, right? So now you're no longer running this as a web server. I mean, in a sense, you're kind of running it, but now you want to basically put the Azure Functions host to sort of sit as a proxy and basically proxy requests and in a serverless manner for this particular web server, right? And the way you do that is, because you've already set it up with the host.json and the functions.json bindings, all you need to do is you can just use the Azure Functions core tools like you normally would, and then from inside of this particular directory, you tell a func start, right, which is going to initialize that sort of run the host and the runtime, and you can see there we go. So now my application is running inside of, it's still at the HTTP localhost 7071 sort of host and port, but now you'll notice that it has this API in front of it. Okay. So if we were to do that, again, same thing, we're making a GET request, we put the API value in front of it, and when we hit send, you're going to see that this triggers a request, and we get a 200 OK, and we get that same value, right? So it's that easy to basically make this an Azure Functions application. You literally, once you have your server set up, right, which you have here, all you need to do is basically define the bindings for the particular endpoints, and basically tell it where can I execute this particular server, and that's basically all there is to it. So that's what happens with a Racket application. So that's a scenario where this particular language is not officially supported by Azure Functions, but again, with Azure Functions custom handlers, you can basically allow it to run inside of an Azure Function application. Okay, so what about the second scenario? Now, this is an interesting one. So let's say that I have a web server that I've already written in a language that is already supported by Azure Functions. And what I want to do is I want to basically be able to use my existing service and the patterns that I and the frameworks that I'm already basically built my service with. And now I just want to change it so that it runs in sort of a serverless, event-driven manner, right? So how exactly do I do that? So in this case, what I have is a Saturn application. So Saturn is basically this sort of framework. It's heavily inspired by the Phoenix framework, right? It's an MVC framework, and it's sort of built on top of ASP.NET Core. Okay. Now, can you build F# Azure Function applications? And the answer to that is absolutely you can. But what if I didn't want to use sort of the C# like way of doing this? What if I wanted to do this with Saturn or some other framework that I find it much easier and much more more F# idiomatic, right? Well, you do that by just building a web server like you normally would with Saturn, right? Okay, so we're doing a lot of the same things here. We're basically defining the port and the URL that our application is going to listen on. Again, we're using that functions HTTP worker port, right? We've defined a sort of route handler, right, called get values. And again, what get values is going to do is it's going to return this object. In this case, we're using an anonymous record with a key of value or property of value, and then an array of numbers. Okay. Then what we do here is we define the router and we tell it, hey, any get request to the values endpoint, basically execute this get values function and basically return it as JSON. Okay. And then we just define our application. We configure it, right? We tell it, hey, for the router, use this API router, and for the URL, use the URL that we defined above, and run our application. So very quickly, and within like 20 something lines of code, we can get this running. It's built on Saturn. And again, I'm using the same sort of patterns that Saturn typically uses, and I'm not sort of confined to what Azure Functions typically would do in a standard sort of .NET environment, where I would have to basically adopt the C# like conventions to run an F# application in Azure Functions, right? So here I'm using what I would normally use if I was building Saturn applications. So again, very much the same workflow. If I wanted to run this, right? One last thing that I missed was again, to basically make this a single executable, right? I just define this in my fs proj file, in my project file, and tell it publish a single file and set this value to true. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to run this particular application. So .NET run, and we tell it win-x64. And the reason we provide the runtime identifier is, again, because we're publishing a single executable. We need to tell it which environment or which deployment target is it going to run inside of. Okay, in this case, we're going to be running it on Windows. But again, because .NET Core is cross-platform, you can do this for Mac and Linux as well. So if we were to run this, it should start the server, and very much like the Racket application, I should be able to basically access that localhost 7071/values endpoint. And as you can see, it's now listening on port 771. Going back to Postman, again, in this case, I'm only running the server, right? No Azure Functions involved at this point. So if we do that and we get the values, there it is, 200 response. We can see that it was processed by the server, and we're getting this particular response. Okay, so okay, now let's turn this into an Azure function using custom handlers. Okay, so again, what do? We basically have a directory that's named after the endpoint that we're trying to set up. Again, nothing different here. It's an HTTP triggered function that's going to accept GET request, and it's going to return an HTTP output. Host.json, same thing, except now we're telling it, hey, look at this particular file, right? We're giving it the path of where to find the single executable. Okay. So now let's run this again using the function Azure Functions core tools. We basically tell func start, and this starts our runtime, starts our host. Right, and then we'll see again, boom, there it is, localhost 771 API values, and now this is running again as an ASP.NET, sorry, as an Azure Functions application. So if we go back here, and again, just to prove that it works, we now set the API value in there. We make the request. We can see it's getting processed, and again, we get that same result. Okay, so that's essentially it for this. So in this whole talk, I've essentially showed you how you can basically use Azure Functions custom handlers for two particular scenarios. One scenario is in the event that Azure Functions, the host or the runtime, does not natively or out of the box support a particular programming language like Go, or in the case that I showed here, Racket. In those instances, you can basically use Azure Functions custom handlers to extend your application and to extend Azure Functions so that your application written in a non-supported language can run as a serverless application. And in the second scenario, what I showed you was, even if we were to build something in a supported in a supported runtime or in a supported language, we can leverage Azure Functions custom handlers to not have to rewrite the application that we currently have set up as a web server, and we can essentially continue to use the patterns that we've already established for our application and the frameworks that we've sort of established for our application, and with a few tweaks and a few configurations, we can basically make our existing application into an Azure Functions serverless and event-driven application. Let me go ahead and paste into the chat the link to this particular application. You're going to be able to find a code that's associated with this application, and you're going to be able to play around with it. And I'm also going to provide additional documentation where you can read more if you're interested in this stuff. Okay, so I just went ahead and I pasted that into the chat. At this point, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them in the chat. Okay. If there aren't any questions, you folks can certainly reach me through Twitter. I'm gonna paste my username on the chat, and you can essentially get in contact with me that way. Just shoot me a message, or yeah. So if you have additional questions on this, again, I want to thank you all for joining. I hope that this was helpful, and at least it gives you some ideas of how you can basically extend Azure Functions to fit the scenario that you're trying to basically deploy to Azure Functions. Additionally, I will say that I have a talk happening at 1 p.m. So in about a half hour, 1 p.m. Eastern time, and that talk is going to be on doing a lot of stuff very similar to what I'm doing here. But I'm basically going to show how you can deploy ML.NET machine learning models using F#, both as a web server and as an Azure function. So please make sure to stick around, grab lunch or breakfast, dinner, wherever you are, and make sure to come back in about a half hour where we're going to be deploying machine learning models using F#. Again, thank you all for joining. I'll see you soon.